Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. If you're like me, you're still adjusting to the time zone change, but there's a lot of time adjustment that's been going on over the last year in our Groundhog Day experience. So one, we want to thank you for joining us today. I'm Charles Renner. I'm an attorney with the Husch Blackwell law firm and the leader of our P3 group, and here with my colleague Brent Meyer, as well as a great group of speakers to pick up the conversation that we've been having for the last many months around public-private partnerships, alternative project delivery, and where the next turn is on the significant amount of infrastructure investment that has been facing the country pre-pandemic and certainly now. A lot of the topics we've talked about in that context have touched on things like higher ed, energy, water, social infrastructure, transportation-related investment, and we've really done it in a national sphere. But the reality is that whenever we do that, we are given cause to touch on an area that I consider to be a market leader in development, in project delivery, and also in infrastructure needs, and that's in the area of our great state of Texas. So we're happy to be pushing our emphasis on a geographic basis today and be in a position to talk about the state of infrastructure needs with expertise on project delivery, public sector focus, and the all-important finance investment that has come with that. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. And if you have any questions during the webcast, please submit them via the question box. And we'll try to answer all questions during the webcast today, but however, if a fuller answer is needed and we run out of time, we'll work on answering those via email. A PDF of the presentation is available in the resource folder, and the program has been approved for legal education hours for those of you that require that. To report your hours, just click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen, and a certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Toward the end of the program, please be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs, and we certainly do. Those have probably had the biggest influence on us as we try to identify the right focus for all that are in attendance. And that's all for the housekeeping items. I would like to get started with the program. And the best way to do that as we begin our focus is to turn it over to my colleague, Brent, and start the presentation. So Brent, please.
Great. Thanks, Charles. Good morning, everyone. I have the privilege of introducing our great panel for the webinar this morning. We're pleased to have Ray DiPrenzio, Executive Director and Co-Head of the Infrastructure Finance from Sumitomo, Judge Robert Eccles, attorney from Husch Blackwell, and Henry Patel, Vice President of Asset Development with Kiewit Development Company. First up, we have Judge Eccles. Judge Eccles is recognized as a national leader in the issues of transportation, public finance, P3, crisis management, disaster preparation, response and recovery, homeland security, education, and healthcare. He served 6 terms in the Texas State Legislature before being elected county judge for Harris County, and has served on advisory committees to President George W. Bush and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Judge Eccles is going to provide some perspective from the public side with respect to infrastructure needs in Texas. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Judge Eccles.
Thanks, Brett, and I'm happy to be here with everybody. And it's kind of interesting talking about the public side and the transitioning into the private sector. Of course, we have learned in the work that we did in Harris County that if you've done a P3, you've done a P3. And everyone is different. There is no model for how to make everyone work. For the P3s to be successful, they have to have a partnership. We did 3 stadia projects in Harris County. They were all different, but they all came in on budget and on schedule. And you've seen Husch, as I moved from the public sector into the private sector, be very successful at doing projects across the country. We can build contracts, and I've learned building contracts from the perspective of the council that can be, outlining responsibilities and deliverables and dates and specificity as to terms, but they can't predict everything that can go wrong. And when you build a process that strengthens the partnership, you can build something that works for everyone. Sandy in our office right now is working in guidelines for the hospital district, for Metro and others, on how to build a process that serves the client and the project. I'm excited to be here with Ray and Henry to hear more from their perspective on the finance and the actual construction side. Of course, here in Texas recently, the big issue for infrastructure has been on the freeze we had in February, where we had the near shutdown of the ERCOT system. And it's one of those crises that develop. Shouldn't have happened. It was a system failure. Folks not communicating as they should between the PUC, the Railroad Commission, ERCOT. There's plenty of corrections and things to go around, but it's one of those opportunities too to build a stronger system. There will be, I think, in the infrastructure side, you'll see hardening of the infrastructure, winterizing the wind projects, protecting the gas supply, particularly designating the various pumping stations and transfer stations as critical infrastructure to ensure they still have power to supply power to the plants. Fundamentally, our system is designed around a market base, and we need more capacity during that peak period. Usually we have this kind of crisis in the summertime, and it's hard to keep thinking about a winter problem when it happens once every 10 or 15 years. I think the last time I saw something like this was 1989. But you're going to have to see a restructuring to create a capacity as the state continues to grow and the demand picks up on our system, and as the system evolves to a more distributed system in place as well. I think you're going to see, too, some emphasis on the distribution system. The sale of generators indicates not just a problem with the delivery with the ERCOT and the rolling blackouts that we saw, but a concern particularly in a more discrete event, a big hurricane or power outage from a thunderstorm that doesn't affect the entire state but affects other areas, that we'll be looking at a hardening of the system, which may provide some infrastructure financing in there. Part of that is private and part of it's public. They're publicly owned systems and public assets. You saw Harris County coming in, particularly looking at how they might even pull out of ERCOT, concerned about the strategic national interest of the Port of Houston and the channel industries and how all that might be affected. I think that there's an opportunity to go in and look at that. I don't see Harris County probably trying to actually pull out, but how you harden and protect those industries is going to be a big factor. Working together too, you're going to see things like the city of Houston, the water supply in the city of Houston. There may be some opportunities there, and public water supplies are a prime opportunity for public-private partnerships. Again, there's a revenue stream that makes sense that allows you to upgrade and improve the water and wastewater system. Other areas that you're seeing big use in Texas, at least in the Houston and the coastal region, is flood control. Harris County had a $2.5 billion plus or minus local bond issue that was planned to be matched by the federal government. With the change in administration and the emphasis that we may see on infrastructure finance and a big infrastructure bill coming through, I mean, it's yet to be seen what that will be, but that all was contingent or planned on at least a federal match to accelerate those projects and the local dollars to make it start. And if you use the normal federal process, what could be 10 or $12 billion worth of improvements will drag on for a long time and will wind up costing $20 or $25 billion and take 20 years. I don't think there's the patience in our community for that right now, and so there's going to be a strong pressure to increase the federal, the speed of the federal procurement process to come in and help us. One of the challenges in the P3 area for something like flood control is there is no regular revenue stream, so it's a different mix you have to come in with how you can do it. There has been a thought on the Texas Coastal Protection Plan that we might look at resiliency bonds. That's another project in the $10 or $12 billion range for the Ike plan in the Galveston Bay area, the surge protection. And again, that's a bargain. $10 billion is a fraction of the cost of a Hurricane Ike type storm hitting the region. It will be a combination of state, local, federal funds, and a potential for having a revenue stream with resiliency bonds, which may try to capture some of the cost savings that come into industry and to the people that live in those areas that are protected by the storm surge, particularly in reduced insurance costs. But if it's going to work right, we need more of a New Orleans style single big appropriation coming through Congress, and they just aren't doing earmarks like that right now. There's also an interesting coalition of in the Southeast Texas area. We helped 8 counties out there create their own local regional flood control district through a local government corporation, where they're working together to maximize revenue and cross-jurisdictional lines for flood control and the like. Transportation, I know many people on this call probably spend more time on that, and you saw Harris County and Texas having a strong history as P3s in the transportation project, particularly in Texas with the Highway 130 project bypass on I-35. That was designed to shift that risk from the state that the road wouldn't perform on those tolls to the private sector. It did not perform, and it was shifted largely to the private sector. They learned some lessons in that, but the legislature's kind of backed off on toll roads as you start moving out of the Houston and Dallas region because of some political pushback. The Harris County Toll Road Authority, we didn't really do a lot of public-private partnerships because we found that if a project made sense, it made sense, and we didn't need the private sector to finance it. But I think you're going to see more issues with the legislature coming in and looking more with Harris County at diversion issues, where you're talk of diverting the toll revenues to the private sector or the general fund of the county. Just doesn't make sense. I think we're going to see maybe some opportunities as we talk about the Texas Central project. We had a little discussion before this call about that, the high-speed rail project, where you have maybe as much as a P5. We've got the public sector through the Texas Department of Transportation, the Houston Metro, the City of Houston, the Harris County Toll Road Authority, and the Texas Central private project working together in places like the 290 corridor, where we've all got projects in that area that need to fit together and not have to be building on top of each other. There's a lot of other areas we're working on. I don't need to get into the lot more time on the higher education, government buildings. We've got a project with the Travis County Courthouse, lots of opportunities for residential, higher ed residential kind of construction, as well as classrooms and education facilities. Our firm's been doing a lot, has a lot of experience in there. So again, it's just building a partnership that works as a partnership to be successful, and everyone is different. So Charles, I'm glad to be here with you and the team. Kick it back to Brent, let him move on to the next group, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Judge Eccles. I did see one question come in. I'm going to hold off until all the panels have an opportunity to speak, and just so we make sure we've got time for everybody, and then circle back. So our next presenter is Henry Patel. Henry is the Vice President of Asset Development with Kiewit Development Group, the P3 development and investment arm of Kiewit Corporation, one of North America's largest and most respected construction and engineering organizations. Kiewit offers construction and engineering services in a variety of markets, including transportation, oil, gas, and chemical, power, building, water, wastewater, industrial, and mining. Currently, Kiewit Development Company is delivering 8 P3 projects with a combined value of $7 billion. Henry has been involved in the North American P3 market for 14 years, and his P3 experience includes Central 70 in Denver, Colorado, Southwest Calgary Ring Road in Calgary, Alberta, Long Beach Courthouse in Long Beach, California, and the new expressway in Fort Worth, Texas. Henry's going to speak or give perspective from the private side. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Henry.
Good morning, and thank you, Brent and Charles, for inviting me. I wanted to spend the next few minutes providing some historical perspective, if you will, on the use of P3s and alternative delivery models. As Judge Eccles mentioned, Texas made headlines nationally and globally last month, and it has been interesting dealing with that, with the proverbial shoulder angel, if you will, on one side and the shoulder devil on the other, having lived through it as a citizen and a user of infrastructure, but also being an active participant and an employee of a contractor. Many of you may be aware of the Kiewit of today, with a workforce of 27,000 staff and craft, 2020 revenues of $12.5 billion, and one of the largest privately owned equipment fleet valued over $3 billion. But what many may not be aware of is that Kiewit started off as a very small Nebraska masonry contractor. Since the late 1880s, Kiewit had to adapt to enter new markets, including transportation. And this adaptation led to the firm building more lane miles of the original highway system than any other contractor. The firm also had to adapt to new delivery models by applying the 135 years of construction experience to engineering efforts. Kiewit was able to give clients what they need most, a project designed with safety in mind, cost effectiveness without compromising functionality. And this led to the firm delivering much of its work currently under alternative delivery models, including P3s. Here in Texas, Kiewit has been involved building and expanding roads, the transit networks, airports, water treatment facilities, offshore platforms, solar and wind farms, as well as power delivery projects, all of them under different delivery models. And if there's a key takeaway that can be summarized from our experience here in Texas and across the US and in Canada, it's that there is no silver bullet. A P3 does not solve all problems, and not all problems can be solved with the P3 delivery model. There really has to be recognition in the differences in incentives, the differences in capabilities, and the differences in responsibilities between the private sector on one side and the public sector on the other. And the history of infrastructure development in the US and across the globe, as I mentioned earlier, can provide us with some key lessons which we should not ignore. Earlier in US history, between the 18th and 20th centuries, a lot of the expansion that occurred within the US and the economic growth that occurred because of it was due because of a two-track strategy to develop and finance infrastructure. Spend public funds to push projects and pull projects developed by the private sector through grants and franchises. People will be surprised to hear that the New York subway system of today started off as a P3 project related to real estate development to grow into other boroughs of the New York area. The post-World War rebuilding efforts really shifted the approach to a single track, push projects developed by the public sector. And this shift really is largely the reason for the prevalence of the use of municipal bonds, the use of the design, bid, build, delivery model to develop the infrastructure in the United States. It was only until the 1990s really that it started to become apparent that infrastructure was wearing out faster than it could be replaced. Now, globally, many of the early adopters of the P3 model focused on performance-based aspects coupled with long-term budget certainty. As an example, in Canada, they've had a strong record on the use of P3s, especially in the healthcare sector. In the early years, more than 50 hospitals valued over $12 billion were all delivered under a P3 model. And by using a long-term performance-based model like a P3 to develop, deliver, and maintain a new hospital, the public sector, the governments, and the municipalities were able to be more certain of the long-term costs related to the delivery and the maintenance of the building. Now, a P3 contract would include specific performance criteria at a predetermined cost for the entire term of the contract, up to 30 years or longer. And of course, from the government side, this was very easy to plan for from a budgeting perspective. They knew the cost over a 30-year term. But more importantly, there was an assurance that the buildings would be kept to consistent standards over those 30 years, that there wasn't all of a sudden a point in time where a building was in disrepair. Now, the public sector also was able to enter into a single contract. That's one of the advantages to a P3 model, compared to having up to 4 separate ones, one for issuing debt to pay for the costs, one to design the hospital, another to build the hospital, and then short-term 5 to 10-year contracts to maintain the building. Now, other adopters of the model globally focused on the private sector's interest and ability to manage more risk. A good example of this project, taking on more risk, is the Channel Tunnel that connects UK and France, a 31-mile tunnel currently in operations. In 1987, it was actually a P3 agreement that was signed between the governments of the UK, France, and a very large private sector consortium team for the development and management of a fixed crossing connecting those two countries. The agreement simply required that a crossing needed to be opened within 10 years, and in return, the contract allowed the private sector to charge whatever it deemed reasonable for a period of 55 years. The public sector didn't want to take any risk on deciding what type of crossing should it be. Should it be a bridge or a tunnel? Should it be specific to rail or should it be specific to road? And the governments also didn't want to take any risk on the commercial aspects. What should be charged? What would be the appropriate charge for allowing for the use of the crossing? But the private sector in this instance was ready, willing, and able to take those risks. Now, this dual track strategy is very much in use here today. As Judge Eccles mentioned, the Dallas to Houston high-speed train is currently being developed as largely a pull project. It's being entirely funded by the private sector, who's willing to take the risk on the use of the technology, what kind of rail cars should be used, and the risk of ridership. How many people would be using this new route and at what fares? Compare that with the transit system, say in Austin, for example, that's being planned for, and that's largely being developed as a push project. It's being entirely funded with a property tax measure. And similarly, the roads projects recently being developed in Austin, the Metroplex in the DFW area, and in Houston have all been developed using different delivery models. Now, no conversation about delivery models is complete without really talking about risk. After all, you'll hear risk transfer as one of those great benefits of P3s. And it is true, the Channel Tunnel is a great example that the more risk can be transferred to the private sector, but only if those risks can be managed by the private sector and if those risks are quantifiable. Generally speaking, from a contractor's perspective, there's only two ways of dealing with risk. Either we manage it ourselves or we find out someone else to transfer it to. And neither one of those options is free, both cost. And more importantly, just because you're able to transfer the risk, it doesn't mean the risk is no longer your problem or that it won't materialize. So just because risk transfer is available doesn't mean risk is gone. Now, the challenge with considering alternative procurement models is to understand how to balance the constraints using a P3 model with its benefits. All else equal, a P3 will cost more from a financing perspective. Financing costs will be higher. The procurement costs will be greater, and there's going to be a greater need for upfront planning. Now, the question is can all these be offset by having an integrated development phase and an optimized focus on life cycle costs? As a concluding thought, there's no shortage of firms willing to invest funds into a project, and the next speaker will certainly attest to that. There's no shortage of firms that are willing to design and build projects such as Kiewit, and there's no shortage of firms that are willing and able to operate and maintain these projects. There's also no shortage of projects that need to be developed. What needs to be recognized is that there is no single procurement method that works with little to no risk and at a low cost. It all depends on finding the right marriage of the project and the delivery model. So in terms of elements to look for when evaluating whether P3 is the right approach for a project or not, has there been a full recognition of the additional time needed upfront for planning purposes? And this does include the time needed to train and educate the public sector staff that will be responsible to administer these projects. Is there clarity regarding full funding for the entirety of the project? Again, a P3 project doesn't necessarily mean funding doesn't need to be dealt with or fully understood. Is the risk transfer reasonable and justifiable? And is there a true partnership being contemplated between the public and private sector? The challenge with infrastructure is that when it's planned for appropriately, designed and built effectively, and operated and maintained efficiently, it's out of sight, out of mind. We don't think about it because it's not an issue. It's only when we have traffic congestion, we have crumbling bridges, we have a loss of power as we did last month, or a loss of access to clean water, that all of a sudden infrastructure comes to the forefront. The challenge is let's not wait for something to be broken before we figure out a plan to how to fix and replace. So thank you, Brent.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. I appreciate those comments at the end. Our next presenter is Ray Taprino. Ray is the executive director and co-head of infrastructure finance at Sumitomo, where he currently leads a team of project finance bankers providing advisory, banking, and other financial services to private developers, construction companies, equity investors, and O&M contractors, working with the public sector entities to develop transportation, environmental, and social infrastructure facilities in North America and the Caribbean. Ray also led the financing for the Vista Ridge project in San Antonio. And so Ray is going to provide a perspective from the finance side. Ray, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brent. And thank you, Charles, and the Husch Blackwell team, and also to my fellow panelists, Henry and Judge Eccles, and to all of you for your interest in tuning in this morning. So there have been just great comments preceding me, and I really applaud all of the remarks that have been made thus far. And I'm going to try to touch on some of them, and again, as Brent is saying, give you a perspective from the banking side. Some of you may not know who SMBC, as we call ourselves these days, or Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation is. We're one of the largest banks in the world. We're one of the 3 largest in Japan, what we refer to as mega banks. But importantly, I think for this discussion is that SMBC has been a leader in the field of project finance, where infrastructure finance resides, for many, many years. And it goes back really to the DNA, if you will, of the bank. It's one of our core competencies, and it's probably one of our most global businesses, in particular because the business of infrastructure finance and project finance is truly global. We have the great pleasure of working not only with local firms, but also with some of the largest, most far-flung international firms, particularly on the construction and engineering side, as well as our partners on legal and engineering and technical support. So we very much bring a global competency to this market. The bank is quite old. It's been around for about 600 or so years. And in the United States, in its current form, as Sumitomo Mitsui is really an amalgam or a roll-up of a number of Japanese banks that have been quite active in the United States for at least 100 years. And in particular, in the modern era, if you will, in the municipal finance market, where Japanese banks were quite active in municipal finance, providing letters of credit to the nascent variable rate demand bond market as that product became quite commonplace. I've been with the bank for over 10 years. I co-head a group that focuses on infrastructure, specifically outside of power and outside of oil and gas. So transport is obviously a dominant sector, but the environment, social infrastructure, which would be anything that is built and of public use, if you will, as well as digital infrastructure, which has become a very important business of ours and an increasingly important focus of the market, if you will, looking at fiber and broadband access, both cellular and wireline. So it is a broad platform. We provide advisory services. We act in the capital markets, and we also provide balance sheet, meaning we provide direct lending. Brent was nice enough to mention the Vista Ridge project. Vista Ridge is probably one of the great case studies, I think, if you will, of how public-private partnerships can come to bear. It was a very long development period, if you will. It actually, I think, without necessarily knowing it, is a great example of pre-development agreements where, in effect, developers were engaged well in advance of financial close, with a risk allocation between the San Antonio water system and the development entity at the time to initiate the design and the engineering and the permits, if you will, of the project. The project took a number of twists and turns, as I think is publicly known in the market. As we got through that, in the end, the Garney companies, Garney Construction, Scott Parrish and his team really stepped up and did what they do best, which is develop water pipelines. They are a premier player in this market. They were not very well known in the bank market. So one of our tasks at SMBC, along with our banking partners, was to really assemble almost $1 billion worth of financing that was largely focused on Garney's ability to bring the project through the final stages of permitting, along with its engineering partners, and also, frankly, the ability of the San Antonio water system to keep its end of the bargain, which, given its strong financial credit rating, was actually something that we were quite confident in, and we ultimately became quite confident in Garney and its ability to do what it does best, but to do it, in effect, a multiple, if you will, of what its typical project is. Risk allocation in that project was key, and it is central to what public-private partnerships are about and what project finance is all about. And we did see in that instance an ability, if you will, of all of the parties stepping up to the risks that they were able to best manage and mitigate, which is really the core to what risk allocation is about, and a core to project financing, as I'm saying. So that project went through a relatively long development period, and then once we hit financial close, we quickly moved towards assembling the final parcels of right-of-way and the final permits coming in hand. One of the things that the bank market was able to do, which is not typical, but it is a competency that I think banks provide, as opposed to, say, bond investors, which have a slightly narrower lane, if you will, that they travel within, is the ability to assess risks that are not necessarily found in every project. So we assessed the permitting regime that was at hand. We had a number of issues associated with right-of-way crossing waters of the United States, public water land. So permitting was a critical issue, and assembling the right-of-way was a critical issue within the confines of Texas's legal parameters in terms of right-of-way for a water project, which the Vista Ridge was a bona fide water project and was certified, if you will, probably not the right legal term, but at the state level. So once we got through all of that, Garney was able to really get to work and complete construction very much on time, and frankly, quite if my client Scott Parrish, who I believe might be in the audience, would say really ahead of schedule, and certainly on cost. And I think that's another important factor that people have to recognize in the modern version of P3s. What construction companies are doing is providing probably one of the more fulsome, if you will, design, build, or turnkey fixed price state certain contracts, which is frankly making our job as financiers easier, if you will. We have very few stranded risks, as we call it, at the project level, meaning that the contractors, the design builders, are really taking all of the obligations associated or that are present, if you will, in the project agreement, in this case, the agreement with San Antonio, and passing those down through to the construction contractors. So that makes our life easier in the sense that we have a single point of responsibility. We know who's in charge, who's responsible, and who's delivering, and we're not really concerned about having to chase one party versus another as the project goes along. So that's I think an important factor to keep in mind when we look at P3s, both in Texas and frankly on a global scale, that between the public sector and the private sector, we have the public sector in effect taking on risks that it is best able to control, and the private sector, through the use of these design build contracts or these fixed price turnkey contracts, taking on the full bulk of project risk, as well as all of the financing associated with that. So that project has gone through a number of different phases. The pre-development phase that I talked about, the construction financing, if you will, that was led by SMBC and was basically a group of 10 international banks that came together to provide that financing. And once we got through construction, we were able to quite successfully take the project into the long-term bond market using a private placement of long-term bonds that now, in effect, have put this project financing on a glide path towards the end of its concession period. So we've really seen all of the phases along the way. Garney was able to take its equity investment and transfer it to a long-term equity investor, Ridgewood Infrastructure, which is quite focused on the infrastructure space and in the water space in particular. And that transition was made, in effect, during the financing. Again, something that the banks were able to work through and look at the terms and conditions associated with that and have that be a relatively smooth financial transaction, if you will, that occurred during the construction period prior to the refinancing of those bonds. So we had all parties in effect here working very, very hard. San Antonio Water System has a tremendous team, a very, very deep bench, frankly, and Garney, led by Scott, and others within the company, really, I think, went above and beyond and probably drew upon skills that they didn't even realize that they had. And again, I would be remiss to not mention, of course, Charles and the Husch Blackwell team working through with that on the legal side, along with Milbank, advising the lenders on that project. So that's a great case study. A couple of other points, maybe just to keep us on schedule here, that I would like to mention. We are at an important juncture, I think, right now with respect to infrastructure finance. The market has been operating quite successfully through COVID. And frankly, during the Trump administration, I think we've had a number of twists and turns along the way that we're able to work through, and projects have been getting done. I think at this point, though, we're fortunate in the sense that we have an administration that's very focused on bringing the full power, if you will, of the federal role to bear in terms of infrastructure. And some of the tools that are in place that might not have been fully utilized, like the TIFIA program, where there's a fair amount of unspent capacity, the RIF program, which is focused on rail. TIFIA is really focused on surface transportation, probably less so on rail. RIF is entirely focused on rail. These are subsidized loan programs. They are hard money loans. They are not grants, but they have been very important tools, if you will, in fostering infrastructure finance development in the United States. And I think there's a very well-oiled machine there. And now I think, frankly, with Biden and his team coming into play, we'll see more usage, if you will, of those, particularly with respect to transit and rail projects, which was less the case, if you will, during the previous administration. So that's an important factor to keep in mind. The WIFIA program, which is essentially a mirror image of TIFIA and RIF for the water sector, has been doing a lot of work in putting, again, these subsidized loans, if you will, out for water projects. Again, another tool that really is available at the federal level that we will see hopefully more use of, or in continued use of, and probably more funding, if you will. Biden's infrastructure plan touches on a number of different areas. ESG is an important aspect of the Biden plan. It's a very important aspect of the financial markets right now. Environmental, sustainable, and governance is generally what it refers to. I can't tell you how often that has become integral, if you will, to discussions right now in and around the world of infrastructure and project finance. Many pools of capital are targeting ESG investments as an important part of their overall portfolio, as well as banks looking at that. And so we will see a lot of effort, and we are seeing a lot of effort, both with respect to investors and lenders, as well as rating agencies and others out there, focusing on ESG and green financings as a way to foster those goals and those policy initiatives, if you will. So that I think will frankly work quite easily into the infrastructure world. Many of the projects that we work on in infrastructure finance are, by definition, checking very many of the boxes that ESG looks at right now. So I think that's going to be a very helpful aspect of the work that we're doing, and we're going to see an increasing amount of it over time. So I think I'm going to pause there. I'm happy to talk about Texas Central High-Speed Rail as well. I think that's a project that is quite monumental, and Judge Eccles is responsible for getting that off the ground, and it is quite far along at this point. So I don't think anyone expected it to make as much progress as it has, but it's been going for quite some time, and who knew that we would have our first true high-speed rail in Texas, of all places. But as Judge Eccles mentioned at a presentation I saw many, many years ago, Texas is flat, and it doesn't have much water. So watch out. The train is going to be coming quickly through Texas, faster than you might think. So Brent, if you will, I don't want to go over my time allotment. I'm going to pause there, and again, happy to circle back with questions as we go from here.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. I may want to circle back to the rail project, but we did get some pretty good questions from the audience, and I did want to tee it up for the panel. The first one, Ray, I'm going to, I guess, point to you first and then kind of open up to the panel. But the question is, how do you see public entities being able to streamline P3 procurements? And just an added commentary here, outside the US, other countries have substantial shorter procurement cycles. Do you care to give some insight on that?
That's a great question. I think first and foremost, at the outset, political will is critical to these types of projects. We are bringing in multiple parties from the private sector who are frankly quite willing to spend millions of dollars in procurement costs, if you will, bid costs. But it's really important, I think, that the public sector entities in whatever jurisdiction we're operating in, whether it's state level or local, in effect, have the commitment in place to head down the path of using private capital and a public-private partnership. That's first and foremost. Secondly, there are very well-honed processes in place to keep these procurements as visible and as transparent as possible. I think that is incredibly important to maintaining the support of not only the political entities, but also of the voters and the citizens at large. Keeping it transparent, making sure that's that with any protection necessary for any kind of proprietary issues, which we can certainly accommodate, but generally speaking, keeping the procurements as transparent as possible. And then I would say from a contractual perspective, I think one of the issues that we have seen as a success factor is keeping the documentation as streamlined as possible and not really reinventing the wheel. Within a jurisdiction such as Canada, which frankly has been a great success story, as Henry would know, we've had the opportunity to work together up there. We have consistency of documentation within each province, and frankly, oftentimes across provinces. And that frankly saves a lot of time. It saves a lot of cost. Documentation is frequently well known to the parties that are coming into play, and the risk allocation elements are contained within that. So that I think is a very, very important aspect of it. Dialogue is key. When we go through procurement processes, obviously we have to be respectful and careful about ethical walls and ethical issues around procurements, but we need to have good, solid dialogue between the private sector and the public sector as we are in the procurement phase and in the pre-development phase, when people perhaps can speak more freely with one-on-one sessions and even industry forums. Very, very important to have that kind of communication, if you will. And then finally, I would just urge, as education is such an important aspect of this. We have such a well-developed governmental infrastructure, if you will, in the United States. Many, many levels of government compared to the rest of the world. We have world-class municipal finance, but project finance is a world in and of itself. And infrastructure and P3 financing in and of itself is as a subsector, has its own specialties. And I would urge all parties to really come together from an educational perspective, bring the right advisors in, not necessarily the most local, though you do oftentimes see a combination of local and national or global expertise, but that's really critical. It's very, very important that the public sector has the right advisors that understand what's going in, and that there's a free and open dialogue of the issues on the public sector side as they approach the private sector with this type of procurement.
Yeah. So, Henry, do you want to have a couple comments about the procurement question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Brent. And kind of leveraging off of some of the comments that Ray provided as well. The first observation is that it is somewhat unfair to compare the United States with potentially other countries, and from the perspective of that we should view the U.S. as 50 independent countries, really. And that's how the system really has been set up to administer and advance infrastructure. And so, but the point is still taken that it does take generally longer to procure a P3 here, whether pick a state compared to other countries. Ray mentioned a couple of those reasons. We still believe two items. One, the machine has been set up to deliver projects under the current model of municipal financing, design, build, for obvious positive reasons that occurred through the history of infrastructure development in the U.S. And I think changing the dynamics of that is always difficult, right? The system has been created and perfected and optimized to deliver quickly on all those aspects under muni, design, build, finance perspective. And so there's going to be some growth pains. The UK, as an example, started in the 80s on its P3 projects. So, comparatively, we are behind it. It's going to take a while to catch up. Two is standardizing the approach, as Ray also mentioned. I think there needs to be a recognition of leveraging work that's been done by other states, other agencies, other DOTs. If there is a standardization of the process, standardization of the contract, that'll also help shorten the procurement cycle. And then two, if there's a way of sharing resources, whether those resources are advisory pools of specialists or individuals that can help manage the procurement, because many times these agencies have a very long pipeline of projects, 50, 100 projects, but maybe only one or two may be suitable for a P3 delivery. And so for the agency to incur costs to train staff to understand how to manage a procurement that includes a P3 may take additional time. And so the ability for agencies to share resources to manage a procurement may also help reduce that procurement timeframe.
Thanks, Henry. Judge Eccles, do you have any comments on the procurement issue or question?
Yeah, the only real, and I can give an example of the difference. First off, Henry made a comment earlier, talked about how the low bid process was built into a federal procurement process, and we were required to use it. And it works well in the public sector because you don't have to explain the low bid process. It's just we got the low bid and built the project. But when you start talking about major, I'll just use the high-speed train as an example, major projects such as the high-speed rail. Talking to my friends in California, we had I was looking at their route and asked why they were going to a particular town. And he said, well, the senator made me do it. And so they were building the project based upon political considerations and a social engineering to link the lower cost or the lower valued real estate and the less affluent communities in the Central Valley over to the coastal communities. Texas Central, we had a similar project we're working on between Houston and Dallas, and we plan to go Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, and our station is going to be in Dallas because of the cost to move over to the Fort Worth area. And we had a letter from 5 of the state senators in the Dallas region that said we had to go to the DFW airport in Fort Worth. And our response was very easy to say, well, we're happy to do it for $3 billion, but we don't have it and the revenue doesn't generate, and the Sumitomo bankers aren't going to loan us money to do that because it doesn't cash flow. And that's the difference in doing a project here and doing it as a private sector and doing it as a public project, is that because we're not funded by the state, we're able to build a project that makes economic sense. And so that's some of the kinds of issues that come up when you get a public-private partnership and we talk about risk allocation and cost, is that one, it's politically easier and more expedient to do a design bid build, and two, the political considerations that sometimes get involved in the projects drive up the costs that make it less practical for the private sector to be involved.
Thanks, Judge Eccles. I wanted to pick up off of these earlier comments and maybe touch on a question for our private sector side folks. And Ray, maybe to you first. You had, I think, done a good job of talking about the financing component and the allocation of risk, and did touch on the strength with the Vista Ridge project on the water systems financial strength as part of what had that project stand in such a good financeable position. One of the things we're seeing now is a significant uptick in procurement opportunities in this project delivery model. We're, part of that theory for that is the financial stress that a lot of state and local governments have seen going through this COVID moment. So the question is, to what extent does the underwriting on the public partner affect financing? And then, Henry, to you, it'd be good to hear from the developer side the amount of vetting or weight that you place into that, particularly given the strength of availability payments as a prevailing model. So, Ray, could you maybe touch on the underwriting perspective on the public partner?
Certainly, Charles. I think maybe we should just make it clear that, as you mentioned, availability payments, the world can be oversimplified into two buckets, if you will. Projects that are driven by volumetric or demand-based revenues versus projects that are supported by a relatively broad tax base that forms the basis of an availability payment. In the demand-based model, we're going to analyze user fees, demand for that particular project, if you will, and that will either be self-evident because it's, say, a water project, and we're very comfortable that the water revenues are going to be there. We have long history, and we're not concerned about that. Or we're going to be looking at something that might be of a startup nature, where we'll need to do significant amount of market research and intelligence and due diligence, if you will, around the usage of that particular asset, if you will, infrastructure asset. Availability payments are based on, as the term would say, the private sector, in effect, making the project available within the terms and conditions of that contract. Once it ticks all of those boxes, and those can be quite specific and quite codified in a concession agreement or a project agreement, but once these are all hit, the project is up and running a certain percentage of the time, as close to 100% as possible. It's staying within its confines, if you will, of downtime. It is within the bounds of its performance perspective, I should say performance specifications, if you will, which could involve deductions against those availability payments. But let's assume that everything is going according to plan, if you will. That project then, in effect, is owed a payment by the public sector entity. And that availability payment can be, again, broadly supported by tax base, by a series of taxes, though not necessarily any one specific one. In the United States, we're fortunate in the sense that we have well-developed sales tax revenues. We have well-developed property tax revenues or general obligation revenues. So we have some choices, if you will. State DOTs have big buckets of revenues that we can put behind, and we have put behind availability payments. But that, in effect, takes the usage risk off the table, and it shifts the focus to the financial strength of that availability payment, as well as the contractor's ability to maintain that project within the confines of the contract.
Great, thanks. And Henry, from Kiewit's view, how is this question starting to influence the way you guys are evaluating project pursuits?
Sure, Charles. And so I guess as a broad statement, as part of any due diligence we undertake for any project, irrespective of the procurement model, we still go through a process of vetting, if you will, counterparty risk. Even if it's a design bid build project or a design build project. In fact, more recently, we are being asked internally to provide an assessment of the financial strength of the owner and client, whether it's private or public, even if it's not a P3 project. That is still very important. So in a P3 project, it helps because some of that information is provided within the procurement documents. But as an example, for a water project, the challenge we sometimes face is that the client may not indicate an upset limit or a maximum price the agency can withstand on a project related to any increases in water rates, for example. And unfortunately, they may only see what the bids come in and then realize, well, we had assumed a 10% increase in water rates, but the lowest bid in this instance is going to require a 13% increase, and we can't get that approved, and therefore the project has to be canceled. Those discussions now need to occur a lot earlier, again, irrespective of the procurement model. But this is part and parcel of the due diligence that we undertake on all projects for all clients, whether public or private.
Great, thank you, Henry. And I want to say thank you to our panelists today for really giving us some great impact, great discussion. As is always the case, at least for me, we run out of time well before we run out of questions. So I appreciate that. I will say, at least subconsciously, one of the reasons that this is, that we've got this geographic focus today is this is usually the time of the year we all gather down in Texas to talk about the U.S. market and infrastructure delivery, and we know that's coming back. I would also ask to keep a lookout. We at Husch usually use this as the time of year to gather the trends analysis for what has happened in the concept of project delivery over the last 12-month cycle, and then what trends we think are coming. I've kind of hinted at that earlier. We're measuring a measurable uptick in project procurements, and part of our thinking is that is really tied to some of the finance discussions we've had here, and clearly we couldn't have timed things better for focusing on Texas and infrastructure other than this discussion. So we appreciate everybody participating, appreciate you all joining us. We hope it was helpful to you and your organization. And as a reminder, the program has been approved for law practice management, legal education hours. So to report your hours, click on the CEU icon. And a certificate of attendance, including the course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording. And finally, we'd ask that you take a moment, if you can, to complete the survey for us as well. I can't stress enough how much we use that to help give us the focus for the next incoming discussion. So with that, I want to thank our panelists, thank Brent, and thank all of you in the audience for joining us and providing us with an hour of your time to kind of work through an important topic. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.